Well, hasn't that been a rich service so far this morning? For those of you who haven't tried it yet, I spent the front part of the service until just a few minutes ago over in Heritage Hall so that the pastor himself knows what it's like to sit in that other room where the simulcast of the service is happening. Hi to all of you in that room over there, about 30 there this morning, and to encourage everybody to try it sometime in the coming months. We haven't made any final decisions yet. We're just testing that to see if that's one way that we can kind of expand our possibilities here without going to a two-service structure here at church. So have a go at it sometime, and we wish all those who are out there right now a great time as we enter this time of preaching. Imagine the following conversation between some very observant and learned seekers of Israel and Yahweh the Lord. The conversation starts something like this. Lord, we need a king. Yes, you do. You really think you need one? Yes, we need a king. Something like David. Okay, I will give you one. I promise. One just like David, in fact, outshining him in all respects. Isn't that good? Here's my word. A child will be born to you, a son, and the government will rest upon his shoulders, and there will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace. He will establish his throne with kingdom and his kingdom with justice and righteousness forevermore. Whew, God, that's good to hear. Thank you so very much for that promise. But wait, I have something else to say. What is it, Lord? I also need to send you a servant. Not like the servants you have known previously, prophets like Isaiah, the nation itself, Moses, and so on. Really, Lord? What do you mean? Give us a second David, and that will be enough. What else could we want? What else might you need? Think about it. You've got me stumped, Lord. Well, I truly believe that you first need a servant before you get your king. One who will do more than just rule impeccably with righteousness and power. You understand why you might need this servant of mine as well? No? Well, stick with me. I will show you what I mean. And there we enter the servant songs of Isaiah the prophet, chapter 42, 49, 50, and then 52 to 53. And possibly one could add chapter 61, verses 1 to 3 as well. I'll say more about that. That's what we're looking at in this 5-part series leading up to Good Friday and Easter. Last week, we looked at chapter 42. God calls a servant. Indeed, it says in the text, he first takes delight in the one he calls. That's such a crucial piece, not just in the teaching about Christ, called Christology in theology, but also in the teaching about salvation, or soteriology as it is called. The delight of God is expressed before he sends his servants on mission. Really, really important reminder. All of us. And then the mission was summarized in 2 key words: justice. Hebrew word is mishpat, meaning so much as a God-ordered society, and covenant. He himself fulfills God's requirements and promises in his person, his servant that is being talked about. Is it Israel, the nation? Seems to be clear in these texts that we are looking at that it's much more than the nation. So in the songs, we are focusing on the ideal, or you might say, as I used the word last week, the quintessential servant. But then we're also asking the question about quintessential service, which has a lot to do with us as well, not just with someone else in this book of Isaiah. So as we read and study these songs or these poems, these prophetic oracles, let's all stand in awe of God's quintessential servant, revealed to us in the New Testament as Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And let's also commit ourselves to modeling or patterning our lives after this servant as we learn to live in a spirit of servant. Attitude, posture, character, these things trump ability and any other outer human signs of success. Keep that in mind. We'll see that especially in this song this morning. So let's dive into chapter 49. I'll just walk you through the text, and then I'll segue to a New Testament text in the book of Romans. So song number 1, the first one that we looked at last week in chapter 42, is basically a biographical statement of God to the world about his coming servant. There, we are told by God, I know your plight, and I will deal with it. In this one, you'll notice it switches a little bit, and it's more autobiographical. The servant's own testimony regarding his worldwide task that appears to have been for naught. You pick up that theme in the song that Lydia Somerville sung for us? The feeling that whatever we've been doing for the Lord has been for naught. In other words, we can say with these two songs, and comparing the first two ones, the first one is almost contemplating the ministry, if we're talking about Jesus here, from the vantage point of his baptism. He heard those words, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And he's looking out onto his calling that would last for 3 years and then would end in his death and resurrection. It looks like 3 years later, this song number 2 is kind of looking back from maybe the Garden of Gethsemane and wondering, has it been worth it? Or has it been all for naught? Already in that short comparison, hopefully you can see the relevance for your own life as well. Called into his family as his sons or daughters, even friends of Jesus, John 15:15. Our ministry, our own mission is set before us. But it can seem at times like we are failing miserably, experiencing no real success. Discouragement can set in, and we're tempted to give in or to give up, or worse still, to continue on in our own power with our own ideas, our own notions of what is good and right and best. Verse 1. Listen to me, O coastlands, and give attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me from the womb, from the body of my mother, he named my name. Servant Messiah is speaking here himself. He is the true deliverer of God's people. Assyria had risen to power and was beginning to conquer the northern kingdoms, the 10 northern tribes called Israel sometimes, over against Judah. And a new king was needed to combat him. And then Assyria takes over the northern kingdom and begins oppressing the people. And what is needed? A servant deliverer more than anything else. And he is promised. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver, he hid me away. The servant calling. Is that Cyrus, the Persian king, who is also called a servant in chapters 44 and 45? I don't think so. Because what is referenced to here is the saving with the word of mouth, not with swords and with armies. That's a reference to the truth shown as a prophet in the prophet par excellence. Verse 3, and he said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. The servant here is called Israel. We might think, oh, that's the nation of Israel meant. I don't think so. In the context, it's only possible to interpret it as a person, not a group of people. But the person here, the servant, becoming the ideal of Israel, what the nation should have been but never attained. Verse 4, but I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing and vanity. Yet surely my right is with the Lord, and my recompense with my God. So in spite of God's calling, in spite of the promise of success, it appears even to the servant himself that he's a failure, a loser by human standards. Jesus on the cross cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Somebody has said, God doesn't approach the arrogance and oppression of the world with greater arrogance or greater oppression. Rather, he comes with humility, the vulnerability and the powerlessness of a servant, yes, even a child. So, on the one hand, it seems like he's a loser. From God's perspective, is eating the task. Therefore, he pleases God. Someone else has said, man's justice gave the servant Messiah a cross, God's justice. Verses 5 to 6, and the Lord now says, he who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. He says to me, it's too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up just the tribes of Jacob and to bring back just the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Here we come to the crux of this servant song. The servant's calling is more than merely bringing Israel back to God in repentance and revival. It would include bringing the light of the knowledge of God, his salvation, his justice to people all over the world. That's where preaching the gospel comes in. God's method to accomplish God's goals. Verse 7 adds, thus says the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel and his Holy One, to one deeply despised, abhorred by the nation, the servant of rulers, kings shall see and arise, princes, and they shall prostrate themselves because of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel who has chosen you. Divine assurance is needed and given to God's servant. God assures him, the Holy One of Israel assures him that eventually the rulers will bow down before him. Does that remind you of something from the New Testament? Philippians chapter 2, verses 10 to 11, after depicting the coming of this servant into the world as Jesus the Messiah, going down, 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 serving us, dying a shameful death, says, and then he exalts him to his right hand, where every knee will bow and every tongue eventually confess. So there's two things that are brought together here, that are wed together. There's the one phase of the servant's life and ministry characterized by rejection and humiliation. And even more than that, that'll come in the following texts. And then the second one marked by acceptance and exaltation. All that Israel, the nation, had experienced, despised, abhorred, used, and more, this servant that God would send would experience too. And all that God intended Israel to ever be, admired, respected, served, that servant will eventually become. Verse 8 to 13, a brief summary. This servant will enable people around the world to return to God. The response to God's intervention and saving work will be universal joy. People, let's always remember that. That day is coming. Don't allow yourself to become cynical of life in the here and now, as difficult, as frustrating as it might be at times. God's promises are sure. They are reliable. Think of your serving others, whether it's in this church or in the community beyond this church, or even beyond that in this country and in the world. Think of your service as going beyond just yourself and that piece of service. You could even think of it as sort of preempting that era of universal joy. We are called to be joy bringers in the lives of others now already, regardless of how others respond. And in the text that follows, it is repeated what already was said in chapter 42, that he makes him to be a covenant for the people. All the promises of God, all the covenant blessings promised, are realized in this servant whom we recognize as Jesus. And it's only in him, in deep union, relationship, personal relationship with him, and in submission to his rule, that these blessings can be enjoyed by all. Blessings in the text such as the breaking of bondages, both physical and spiritual, the protection and provision for his sheep, he's the shepherd, the overcoming of seemingly insurmountable barriers, and especially the worldwide worship of God. All these things never fully happened, even after Israel would return with the help of Cyrus, the Persian king, to the land. Verse 13, let me just read that one. Sing for joy, O heavens, and exult, O earth. Break forth, O mountains, into singing. This is Isaiah inviting everybody to join in worship, for the Lord has comforted his people. Past tense. It's coming, but he views it as past tense, and he will have compassion on his afflicted. Isaiah calls on the whole world, the whole created universe, to rejoice, because God had indeed. The effects of the fall, sin as it has entered this world and impacted our lives, they're finally overcome by God's servant, the Messiah, whom we are privileged to know as Jesus. Flip a moment to Romans chapter 9 and 10 and 11. Actually, I'll just go start at the beginning of chapter 10. In this section, Paul is wondering. He kept wondering over and over again. He couldn't really understand it, why his fellow Israelites were so strong, so stubborn in continuing to reject Jesus, the Messiah, whom he had come to know very personally on that road to Damascus, his conversion experience to Jesus. And in these texts, he's wondering about that, and he talks about it. And chapter 11, he'll mention, yes, there is hope that one day there will be a turnaround, and they will recognize Jesus. National Israel will recognize Jesus. But in the meantime, what are we to do? So referencing his countrymen, his fellow Israelites, he says in chapter 10, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end, the fulfillment of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. For Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them, has to live by them completely, perfectly. But the righteousness based on faith says, don't say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will ascend into the abyss to bring Christ up from the dead? But what does it say? Here's the word that's near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be. With the heart one believes and is justified, made right in the relationship to God, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. For Scripture says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And we could go on into that text and on into chapter 11, but I won't do that. These 3 chapters are chock full of quotations from the Old Testament, and in particular from Isaiah the prophet. And what connects the two is the posture of faith that you'll find in the Old Testament and New Testament. What is that? A receptive, submissive spirit. Submitting gladly and sincerely to the knowledge and lordship of Christ. Submitted gladly, knowledge of Christ, the lordship of your life. That servant models this receptive, submissive attitude. And then he comes and shows us how life can truly be lived. And he'll have quite a price to pay. Now he invites us to join him and experience the life of God in a. Instead, in our country, in our places where we live, we're often proud of being self-made men, as the expression goes. That thought came to me these days, and I got thinking about that a little bit. Where does that statement come from? Well, it's a classic phrase, a self-made man, that was first coined in 1832, almost 200 years ago, by a United States senator who used this term to describe individuals in the manufacturing sector of the United States whose success lay within the individuals themselves and not with outside conditions. About 25 years later, a guy called Frederick Douglass held a famous lecture called Self-Made Men, in which he describes what a self-made man is and how one can become one. That whole idea of American dream and so on. We can do it. I can figure it out myself. Winston Churchill's famous, "We are masters of our fate" speech to the U.S. Congress 2 years after the war began. We are made men. We sometimes think, here's a little picture, kind of shows that. Somebody making himself, the statue there, out of nothing, out of the rock. I think that's a good descriptor of the typical religious person, the typical Jewish religious person, especially in the time of Paul. And that occasions a lot of his writings. And Paul is worried about the repercussions of that thinking, like the eternal repercussions for a faulty posture at the core of our being. We can do it. I can figure my life. Servant models a different. Somebody has said about this self-made man idea, guy called Adams, there is no such thing as a self-made man. We are made up of thousands of others. Everyone who has ever done a kind deed for us or spoken one word of encouragement to us has entered into the makeup of our character and of our thoughts as well as our success. And that's not even to mention God in the equation, which is really important. The Creator, God Himself. This is what He says in Deuteronomy chapter 8. Take care of the Lord your God. Skip down to verse 17. Beware lest you say in your heart, I'm a self-made man. Well, the text doesn't actually say that. It says, beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability, the power to get wealth. He may confirm His covenant that He swore to your fathers. Paul, in Romans 9, 10 especially, which I just read, sees relevance here for all of us Christ, whether Jew or Gentile. It comes down to this. We have a wonderful story to tell. Actually, a wonderful story to show and tell. This church has 9 or 10 missionary couples out there doing that showing and telling full-time, as it's sometimes called. The rest of us are doing it not part-time, but full-time, just in slightly different ways. Draw your attention to a little book that talks about this slightly different ways. Ray Clausen, our outreach consultant, working 10 hours a week here, supporting us, is taking this little book through with a class right now. You still want to join that class? They can still join, right, Ray? Yeah. It's called Surprise the World: The 5 Habits of Highly Missional People. And here's a short summary, an Amazon summary of this book. Christianity is a surprising religion. It has changed the world in remarkable ways throughout history, simply through Christians living out their faith where they are. More recently, we've become sort of afraid of a habituated Christianity, thinking that routines will rob our faith of its vitality. The net effect is that we've replaced the habits that surprise the world with habits that mimic the world, and both we and the world suffer for it. And so he talks about integrating 5 simple habits under the letters BELLS, bells. Easy to remember, right? First one, bless others as often as you can in your week. Eat together with others, not just with your family and friends, with the usual people. Listen to the Spirit, learn Christ, and understand yourself as sent by God into others' lives. And if we do that, we will learn to spread the gospel organically, graciously, and surprisingly. If you want to know more about that, you can engage the class there. I think they have a couple of extra copies yet, right, to give away or for you to buy, be the better way to put it. So let me wrap up. Israel, the nation, was meant to be a servant to the world, bringing the light of God to the rebellious nations. Failed miserably. So God sends another servant, a man very different than the Davidic king of Jewish expectation. His mission, to bring justice, God-ordered society, not just back to Israel, but to the world, to the nations. The basis is faith, simple, childlike trust that gladly submits self to the lordship of this other servant whom we know as Jesus. He, the ideal servant, models to us true servanthood in all of life. And the result is that we together also desire to go to the nations, humbly, courageously, in His name as His sent ones, but not with the typical weapons of the powerful: manipulation, force, coercion, corruption, lying, cover-up, money, but with the show and tell posture talked about in this book. Just think about, I'll throw you 3 pictures of a couple of missionary families. Think of Renee and Ingrid Schultz. In Japan right now for a year of teaching English. They might extend that for a second year. By the way, you can pray for her. She's expecting to have an operation any day now. She has some gallstones that have been causing severe discomfort. Continue to pray for them. They're our youngest or latest missionary couple from this church. His dad and mom, Victor and Rita Schultz, they now serve in Winnipeg amongst the Slavic people. They're also members of our church. And then do think of one of their multiply colleagues. In that picture, you see a guy called Pon Kao and his wife, Chanson, I'm not sure how her name is pronounced. And I'm putting them up here. They are missionaries that have lived in the U.S. for about 20 years, and then they went back to the country of Laos to work amongst the Khmu people. And Pon Kao, I've met him in person. If I remember right, he is actually a former CIA agent back in the 70s, 80s, when communism and capitalism in the U.S. were at odds with each other in Southeast Asia. Was thrown in jail, came to Christ, and there's literally a church planting movement that has been generated by the two of them, he and his wife together. They're like this in serving the people. Hundreds of churches, as far as I know, have been started through their influence, major influence. They had a car accident. He passed away. The funeral was just this week. They are doing very, very significant, powerful. Keep them in your prayers. I'm putting these people up just so that we appreciate the tension between local. This is what we all can do. Bells, bless, eat together, learn, listen. View yourself as a sent one, even if you don't go to Japan, or you don't go to Laos, or you don't go to the Slavic people of Winnipeg. But these people deserve our special support, our special care. God sends his servants belong to them. On a very practical level, I just want to draw your attention to something that's already in the bulletin coming up. Over the next 4 weeks, I hope that you will engage in some habits that help you to prepare for Good Friday. And we do that in the Advent season. Prepare for Christmas. Why not also do that with Good Friday and Easter? So one of the things that Christians do is they fast leading up to Easter. I invite you to do that. And if you're not sure about how to do that, I've got a document that I've drawn attention to in the past out at the Information Center. Grab a hold of that and get some ideas and figure out something to fast from as your sign of your desire to be rejuvenated in your faith, to be reconnected with Jesus on an even deeper level in this season. And as we get closer to Easter, you will notice that Thursday evening leading into Good Friday, sometimes in the calendar is called Maundy Thursday. Maundy from the Latin word mandatum, from the opening words of John 13:33, where Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you." Commandment, mandate, and then he washes their feet. And so on Thursday evening before Good Friday, we're going to have some prayer stations set up in the Heritage Hall area and classrooms. Would invite you to make that a priority, to come for an hour or two to just dig deep into your relationship with the Lord. Receive from him whatever he wants to give you, so that you will be rejuvenated and your faith will be sparked again, fanned into flame. I'd like to invite the team to come up as we conclude the two songs.